Hi everyone, I'm Stan from Eagle Vision. I'm here with David Lipschitz. David, welcome.
Great to be here.
So today we're going to talk about something fairly serious, and it's construction finance. David's been running a company called Logic Finance for the last 15 years, and it's an award-winning firm specialising in construction funding. So we're going to break up these series into three: acquisition, construction, and ultimately retention. Today we're going to talk about acquisition. So David, in the cases of when a developer goes out there to acquire a site, what are some of the major considerations they need to think about up front?
Stan, again, thank you for having me. And I will say it's smart what you're doing about breaking these up as to three different segments, because there are three distinct areas of analysis for a developer when they're looking to work through the journey of a development. And each of the three will require a different finance solution, right? So it is important to sort of look at them differently. That being said, it's also important to look at them holistically as well, because invariably lenders are going to want to know what's the exit strategy, exactly how you're going to be able to, when you get to the funding stage, it's all very well you can fund the acquisition, but how you're going to be able to fund the construction and so forth. So it is important to do that. But with regards to acquisition, there's a whole host of considerations, and I guess it is horses for courses. There are a number of developers, like I'm dealing with a development right now where the client's looking to purchase it essentially as a residential loan, a consumer loan, which opens up a whole host of other issues, but it does mean that they can borrow more, so that's the first thing, but they don't have to worry about, demonstrating that it's got the feasibility has legs and all that sort of stuff. And often that's just a good way just to, if the developer knows, particularly a developer that's already done these homework, but he doesn't have the DAs and so forth, sometimes it's just useful just to go in there, purchase it as residential, lease it or rent it out, and while that's happening, there's a whole host of stuff bubbling away, getting through the DAs, making sure they've got all the engineering and all that other stuff, so that when they're ready to turn the key, they can go with that, and it doesn't always have to be with the same funder.
Sure. So that's the optimal way, essentially. Getting in, buying a residential, and then working through and hopefully optimizing the DA and so forth.
Yep.
So what are some of the, gearing considerations that you can talk about for acquisition?
So I mentioned before, with regards to residential, you probably want to keep it, it can go up to 80% or below. You really wouldn't want to go more than that. Whereas if it was commercial, you'd generally, and there's a number of funders that would probably cap it out at 50%. Right. But generally, let's say 60 or 65%. The downside of doing residential is you have to demonstrate that you can service it in your own right, whereas commercial, often you can sort of look at it as a sort of a standalone business, if you like, where it can fund itself, you can add interest capitalization and so forth. Yep. So you gear less, and often there's a whole host of hoops to jump through. But I guess, as a colleague of mine once said, for a development or getting funding for a development, the lenders are like your unpaid risk department, right? So they're the ones doing all those double checks, that sometimes, even if you're a pretty diligent developer, you might miss, and they've actually gone through, and so you've got this extra set of eyes checking it, but it does mean that it does become a bit more onerous to jump through. I mean, I'll say this, and I know we're going to get to construction at a later stage, but there are certainly a number of developers that I deal with that are so over having to jump through all the hoops that they just happy to focus on funding the acquisition, and the construction they just fund with cash. Okay. Or some equity release that they've got elsewhere. If they can, correct. I mean, obviously it suits only some, but nonetheless, they are obviously they've got enough confidence in their ability to be able to manage the process, and they don't need that extra risk department, if you like.
Got it. Yeah. Fair enough. So purchasing the site freehold obviously is the optimal solution.
Yes.
Are there any alternative ways of purchasing sites with funding solutions? Yeah.
So when we say purchasing the site freehold, that's important because it means that you leave all the equity there, which will be used at a later stage when you're funding the construction. Like if you're not going to fund the construction, then you obviously wouldn't fund it freehold. And when I say fund freehold, it doesn't mean just use cash. You generally would try to use equity from elsewhere, right? Yeah. But if you have to use the site to fund, that's still okay, because there's a number of, certainly I've seen it with clients of mine where they've gone and purchased the site for, let's say, X, they've had to use some funding to secure it against that site, but then they've gone and added value to the site, right?
Okay.
So let's say 12 months later or thereabouts, when everything's ready, they can ready to turn the key on the development, there's a whole host of additional value, as in the DAs are being issued and so forth.
Yeah.
And so because there's additional value, there's additional equity, and so therefore it still kind of works out, but it is a leap of faith that they are going to be able to generate that additional value.
Yeah, I understand. And so are there any lender pitfalls in going down an alternative route?
As in going down the alternative route of
buying site with an option or things like that.
Yeah, so I guess this is, and I think the lender pitfalls that I often see with, and this is over the last 2 decades of seeing various developers, fall on their face sometimes, and often they're the ones that don't do the homework before. The key pitfalls that I see are generally related to cash flow. Okay. They gear themselves up. They don't have very little room to move. They say, if all the stars align, then we'll be fine. But ever so often, and let's be honest, when it comes to construction, that's the risky part. That's why funders charge a premium during construction, because that is the risky part. And that's why a lot of funders don't deal with construction, because that is the risky part, right? So hence the reason why a lot of funders don't allow for owner builders, by the way. But let's just say that cash flow, if they can manage cash flow and they've got contingencies in place, that is one of the big pitfalls that come through. The second key pitfall is to start getting a bit over-ambitious with their FISO in the first stage. They're going, well, it's all going to work out because I'm going to sell it for 20% more than the current market, right? Well, not really, and the best FISOs I see always work on the current market. I know we're sort of getting into construction here, but it does play a role when you're purchasing that initial site, right? Because they can gear themselves up and hope that they're going to get that additional value, or hope they're going to be able to sell it for more, or hope they're going to get pre-sales, and then suddenly that. And by the way, when we're talking about pre-sales, that's actually a lot of that's going to happen during the acquisition stage as well.
Oh, really?
Because you've just purchased the site, you want to get the pre-sales well before you get to the construction. And often you actually want to go to the funder and say, by the way, I've already got 10% already pre-sold. I'm going to sell a few more. I want to get an approval, and they'll say, "Yep, you need to get up to 50%," or like with the majors, get more. So pitfalls is cash flow. Pitfalls is being I guess, over ambitious with how it all works. And I guess one of the other pitfalls is probably not doing their homework. Because often they say, "Oh, this will be a great site. I can subdivide and do this, etc." Whereas having a real understanding of what the council will allow, having a real understanding of what the site will allow, where I've seen clients go in, purchase it, and they go, it's all going to be peachy, and it becomes pear-shaped, right? Because they probably haven't done that initial homework.
And what kind of a percentage do you get out of that? Is it out of 20 you get 5 that get to that point, or is there more than that?
Oh, listen, these days, certainly clients of mine, I make sure that they do their homework beforehand. You wouldn't want them to purchase prior. But I guess the other thing to think about this, and this is a business, right? Essentially, developments are a business. You, much like any business, you look at what is worst case scenario. What are you going to do? So, for example, you buy the site, so long as you haven't paid too much for the site as it stands, even if you can't make it a going concern and really realize the value in the site, worst case scenario, you can still sell it for what it is and maybe just get away with your shirt on your back, right?
Yeah.
But it's for those that probably haven't thought through some of those exits. So I guess the only point I'm trying to make here is just sort of instilling the idea that it is a business and just thinking about some of those factors. Yeah,
absolutely.
But I guess the other thing to note here is that I talked before about if you can buy it as a residential, and by the way, then you're jumping through 1,000 hoops, as with consumer regulation the way it is, consumer loans. The issue is if you're buying a big site. If you're buying a site that is the type of site that you're probably not going to be able to afford from cash flow, right? So what do you do there? Well, half the time it has to be commercial, right? Because you have to say, well, I'm buying it for the purposes of realizing the value, and there's a clear exit strategy, and this is going to be a short-term loan. If that's the case, then you sort of have to get comfortable with it being a commercial loan from day one. Makes sense? And so if there's nothing else, the key takeaway from all this, and we'll talk about assessment requirements and so forth in a minute, but the key takeaway from all this is there's a whole myriad of complexity that goes with it, and that will depend, and so which lender you go with will depend on your strengths, will depend on this site, will depend on your experience, and a whole host of other factors. Yeah.
Great. And that brings us to the question, because a lot of developers, when they've looked at commercial funding, they're trying to obtain finance based on the valuation rather than whatever, I guess, the purchase price of the site is.
Right.
How do they do that?
Well, the way I've seen it done before, and the way clients of mine have done it, is where they have put an option on the site, they've realized the value, as I mentioned, they've actually provided some real value there. And I think the one thing I probably haven't talked about to date is, in addition to just funding the site as is, right? You also need to allow for funding for the soft costs. That's all those costs that go with, getting the DAs issued, right? So they've actually spent some money in actually getting to that point where the site is now a going concern. It actually has real value, or has increased value, and you can go back to a funder and say, by the way, I've now got increased value. It's a bit like buying a commercial building and saying, well, I'm going to clean it out, revamp it, I'm going to get new tenants in that are going to pay a premium for that, and therefore I'm now going to get it revalued. You know what I mean? And saying, I've now provided new additional value to the site. Same thing goes for a property development. So I think they have to provide that real value. The issue at the moment is valuers are being overly conservative, right? Okay. So they will err on the side of caution every time. And there certainly was a period during COVID where they were very conservative. I think it's starting to open up now. Clearly the market's getting pretty hot at the moment, eastern states, but also Adelaide. But it's also interesting to see that valuers are still going to err on the side of caution unless you can actually demonstrate something there, right? So for example, I mentioned before, like getting pre-sales during that initial bit, getting pre-sales just after you've got acquisition. So you get the DAs, you get some pre-sales, at least even if it's just a couple, and then you can go to the valuer and you say, by the way, I now need to, or you haven't settled on it, you need to settle on it, and the valuer goes, wait a minute, what's the, then they value it a few different ways when you're actually getting to the construction side, they value an as is, which is just the land value, They value it with the DAs and so forth, right? And then the value on completion, if you like. But if the value with DAs, where they actually look at everything, and they're going to go, well, hold on, you've already sold it for this, so therefore that's a good benchmark that you're going to be able to make this, and therefore you've demonstrated value. So it's probably a complicated answer, and I apologize, but it just says...
But there is room to create
There's definitely room, but I wouldn't rely on it. I would look at it as a bonus, and that's why I'm saying always look conservative when you're doing those FISOs, because if you're conservative, then it still kind of works out, right? And I think the other thing is, and I know again we'll get to construction in the next segment. Doing the FISO on what the site's going to realise, you really want to make sure that you get your margins, right? And you reverse engineer it, right? So you look at the margins, and really you wouldn't get into a project for under 15%. Margin. You wouldn't, right?
It's just too high.
It's just too high, and often with two lots, you're just not going to get that, right? As a rule of thumb, you're not going to get it. Not in the current market where they're paying too much. Possibly 3 lots and more. And as you get the bigger developments, the margin should go up to 20%, maybe 25%, 25 lucky. But I will say this though. You work out your margin, work out your basic margin, you reverse engineer it, right? And then you get back to the point of how much are you prepared to pay for the site? Exactly. You know what I mean? And there's so many developers that don't go through that exercise, right? Reverse engineer it until you can get to the end, and that's how much you pay. You go to the auction, you don't go more than that, right? Where you get developers that pay too much. Often it's mum and dad and developers pay too much. And then they wonder why they haven't made any money or they've lost money. Well, because they probably didn't do that homework. In the first instance. So I think that's pretty important.
Very good. Excellent. Look, that's all that we sort of wanted to cover in this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Next time around, we'll talk about construction, and there's a lot more to cover. Thanks so much.